Nia Matthews, the determined head of the Internal Affairs Division, had spent years working tirelessly to root out corruption within the police force. But her latest battle, one that would force her to confront the darkest corners of law enforcement, was personal. When Officer Trent Holloway, a racist cop with ties to a dangerous white supremacist group, crossed her path, he thought his badge and power would shield him from accountability. What he didn't count on was Nia's unwavering determination to take down the corrupt system, no matter the cost. She had learned early in her career that standing up for justice often meant taking on battles that no one else dared to fight. But as she pursued Holloway, Nia never imagined just how deeply her commitment to exposing the truth would push her to the edge. Holloway's network reached far beyond the precinct. He had connections with judges, fellow officers, and even higher-ups who weren't just blind to his actions, but actively protected him. As Nia dug deeper, she found herself not just battling an individual, but a machine. A system so entrenched that it seemed impossible to bring it down. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Nia held her ground. She knew the risks, she knew the cost, but nothing could silence her, not even when the people she thought she could trust began turning their backs on her. When she finally cornered Holloway with hard evidence, leaked financial records, audio recordings, and witness statements, she believed she had him. She thought justice was within her grasp, but Holloway wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was a man with power, connections, and the will to strike back with a vengeance. After an attempt on her life and the kidnapping of her son, Malik, Nia's resolve was put to the ultimate test. She fought back, exposing the lies that had been buried for far too long. And despite the personal toll, she became a symbol of courage for the community. The protests that erupted after her exposé proved that people were ready for change. But Trent Holloway's reach was far greater than Nia had anticipated. Her fight was far from over. He twisted the narrative, turning her into the villain, painting her as the instigator of chaos, and using his connections to push through a series of devastating counterattacks. Even as she lay bloodied in the hospital bed, the thought of giving up never crossed Nia's mind. Instead, she found the strength to keep fighting, knowing that exposing this corruption could bring about a reckoning. Her persistence, no matter how painful or lonely, was not in vain. And now the battle is far from over. If you're inspired by Nia's courage, determination, and unwillingness to let corruption win, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that fight for justice. Join the movement, because the fight for truth is something we can all be a part of. Nia Matthews had always known that her work in internal affairs would put her on a collision course with the darkest parts of law enforcement. But she never imagined that her fight for justice would take her this far. As head of the division, Nia had seen the worst that corruption could do. Officers abusing their power, judges turning a blind eye, and entire precincts covering for criminals wearing badges. But this time, it was different. Officer Trent Holloway wasn't just another crooked cop. He was a man with deep connections, a man who believed his badge would shield him from accountability, no matter what horrific actions he took. And Nia, determined to make the system right, was his biggest threat. She had spent years dismantling corrupt officers, pulling apart webs of deceit that ran through the heart of the police force. She knew the risks of standing up to people like Holloway, people who had the power to ruin lives. And she had faced threats, slander, and attacks on her reputation before. But nothing prepared her for Holloway's game. He wasn't just a cop with a bad reputation. He was a man who had ties to a network of white supremacists, a dangerous alliance that extended deep within the city's police force. They called themselves Pure Badge, an old group with a violent history of racism, and they would do anything to protect their own. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was an entire orchard, rotting from the inside out. Nia was about to uncover just how deep that rot ran. Nia had dedicated her entire life to dismantling the kind of corruption that Holloway represented. But what she didn't expect was how personal it would become. When she first locked eyes with Holloway, she saw the hatred in his gaze, the way he looked at her not just as a threat to his power, but as a symbol of everything he despised. She could feel the venom in his words as he spat at her, mocking her for her position, calling her just another woman in a man's world. She had learned early on to mask her emotions, to hide her fury behind a calm, professional demeanor, but something about Holloway's presence set her blood on fire. He wasn't just trying to maintain his position. He was trying to crush her spirit. But Nia would not be broken. She stood tall, knowing that her fight was bigger than just one man. This was about exposing the rot that had infected the entire system, and Holloway was the perfect target. She thought she could break him, bring his lies into the light, and finally end the nightmare. She gathered every shred of evidence, using her knowledge of the law and her access to confidential records to piece together Holloway's network. She was ruthless in her pursuit of justice, relentless in her drive to expose his criminal activities, but it wasn't enough. Holloway's friends in high places, those who protected him with their silence and complicity, would not let Nia succeed. The first time she felt the full weight of Holloway's power was the night she was pulled over on her way home. It was a routine stop, or so she thought, but Holloway was there, and he knew who she was. She watched as his smirk curled into a sneer when she introduced herself as the head of internal affairs. The game had changed in that moment, and she realized that he wasn't going to back down. She had hoped that her badge, her title, would be enough to stop him in his tracks. But Holloway didn't care. His eyes were full of rage, and he was determined to put her in her place. He humiliated her in front of a growing crowd, and when he slammed her against the hood of her SUV, she could feel the heat of his hatred in every touch. She wasn't just an officer to him. She was the enemy. And yet, Nia never flinched. She fought back with everything she had, using the calm professionalism she had honed over years of fighting corruption. She knew the law better than most, and she knew she was right. But Holloway wasn't interested in the law. He wanted power, and he would destroy anyone who stood in his way. In that moment, he used every trick in the book, spinning lies and using his influence to make sure she wouldn't be able to escape his grasp. Nia, hands cuffed, bleeding from the rough treatment, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I'm not resisting," she called out to the crowd, her voice steady, though inside, the rage was boiling. But she could see it in the eyes of the people around her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the system they all knew was broken, and they were starting to see it too. The crowd had gathered around her, their phones already capturing the scene. And in the chaos, Nia realized that this was her moment to turn the tables. She wasn't going to let Holloway frame her. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. She had fought for too long, and she wasn't going to let him use her as a pawn in his game. The officer was pulling every card he could play, but she wasn't playing by his rules. She kept her cool, and when backup arrived, Nia could see the shift in the air. The crowd was on her side, and though they were still outnumbered, they had a weapon. Truth. And truth, as she knew well, was a force more powerful than any lie. But even as she stood tall, ready to fight back, Nia knew that Holloway's influence ran deep. When the officers arrived, Nia recognized them. They were the same ones who had always turned a blind eye to Holloway's actions, the same ones who had enabled his reign of terror. She saw them in the way they treated her, dismissing her as a threat to their precious status quo. When they told her to let it go, the weight of their betrayal hit her like a ton of bricks. They were part of the problem too, They were the ones who allowed men like Holloway to thrive. The system was rotten, and Nia knew that the real fight was not just against Holloway. It was against the very institutions that enabled him. And yet, despite the crushing realization that she was up against an entire system, Nia did not back down. She wasn't going to let them bury her. She had always known that fighting for justice would come at a cost, but she never imagined it would cost her everything. The next few days were a blur as Nia scrambled to protect herself from the fallout. She filed her reports, started gathering evidence, and leaned on Marcus Tate, her most trusted ally. She knew he was there, fighting beside her, just as determined to bring Holloway to justice. But nothing prepared her for what came next. Holloway fought back harder than she could have imagined, using his connections to smear her reputation, file false charges against her, and make sure the law wouldn't protect her. He made sure that no one would believe her, and that the system that was supposed to be her ally would turn against her. It wasn't long before Nia found herself cornered. Holloway's deep ties to the police force and the network of corruption that supported him became even more apparent when she discovered that her own colleagues were turning against her. They questioned her credibility, dismissed her as a troublemaker, and gave Holloway the upper hand. With every false claim, every smear, and every threat, Nia was forced to watch as her hard-won reputation and career were stripped away from her. Her home was raided, her son was kidnapped, and she was beaten down both physically and emotionally. The fight was no longer just about exposing Holloway's crimes. It was about surviving a war against a system that was determined to see her fail. But even as she was beaten, even as she was dragged into the depths of this fight, Nia never gave up. She knew that her fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been oppressed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. And so, despite her pain, despite the terror she felt every time the phone rang with another threat, she kept fighting. She fought for the people who believed in her, for the ones who would never give up on the dream of a just world. The cost was high. So high that at times, Nia wondered if it was worth it. But with every injustice she uncovered, with every lie she exposed, she knew she was getting closer to the truth. And then, one day, it all came crashing down. Holloway had underestimated Nia's resilience. He had underestimated the power of the truth. She exposed his ties to white supremacist groups, his use of public funds for criminal activities, and the web of lies that had protected him for so long. It was a battle that had seemed impossible, but in the end, she won. The city stood behind her, and Holloway was exposed for the monster he was. But victory came at a steep cost. As the crowd cheered outside, Nia could see Holloway's final strike. One last betrayal, a frame job so brilliant that it almost succeeded in taking everything from her. But she refused to let him win. She had fought too hard, and she wasn't about to give up now. This is where Nia's story begins to shift. The truth is, the fight for justice is never easy, and the system is never on your side. But one person standing firm against the tide can change everything. Nia stood, bruised but unbroken, her soul burning with the fire of the truth. She wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. If Nia's story has moved you, if you believe in the fight for justice and the strength it takes to face down the corrupt forces that run our systems, don't let her journey end here. Hit that subscribe button and join the movement for justice. Stand with Nia as we continue to expose the corruption that's been allowed to fester for far too long. Nia Matthews had always prided herself on being someone who stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. As the head of internal affairs, she had spent years dismantling the worst of the worst. Crooked cops, corrupt officials, and systems that shielded the very people who were supposed to protect and serve. But nothing could have prepared her for the storm that was about to engulf her when she crossed paths with Officer Trent Holloway. Holloway wasn't just any cop. He was a man with power, with deep ties to the city's worst elements, and he wasn't going to let Nia expose his crimes without a fight. What started as a routine case of exposing corruption in the ranks soon escalated into something far darker and more dangerous. As Nia soon found out, she wasn't just up against a bad cop. She was up against an entire corrupt system, willing to stop at nothing to protect itself. The first time Nia truly realized the extent of Holloway's reach was the night she was targeted. It started innocuously enough. She had been working late, wrapping up the details of an ongoing investigation into several officers who had been taking bribes, when she decided to head home. The streets of Atlanta were still buzzing with activity, the hum of traffic and distant chatter filling the air as Nia cruised through the city. But just as she turned a corner near her apartment, she saw the flashing lights behind her. It was a routine traffic stop, or at least it should have been. But when she saw Officer Trent Holloway's cruiser pull up behind her, a shiver ran down her spine. She recognized him immediately. The officer whose name had come up in several of her investigations. A man with a history of bending the law, of using his badge to get away with things that would have cost anyone else their job. She never imagined he'd be the one to stop her, though. When Holloway approached her window, Nia did her best to keep her composure. She rolled down the window, flashed her badge, and introduced herself. But the second he saw who it was, his demeanor shifted. His eyes darkened, and that smirk she had seen in her reports curled onto his lips. "Well, well, well, if it isn't the mighty head of internal affairs," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "What are you doing out here, Matthews? Shouldn't you be sitting behind a desk somewhere, reading the rules instead of following them?" The casual dismissal in his voice made her stomach turn, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. Nia had learned long ago that if she let them see her weaken, they'd use it against her. But Holloway wasn't finished. His smirk faded into something darker, something dangerous. "You've been making a lot of noise lately, Matthews. You think you can just go around tearing up everything we've built? Well, let me tell you, you've picked the wrong fight." Nia's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Officer Holloway, I'm doing my job. I suggest you do the same. Now, if you have a reason to pull me over, I'd like to hear it." She could feel her heart racing, but she wouldn't let him see that. She knew the power he had, the web of corruption he was part of. If she made a wrong move, it could cost her everything. She was used to being the target of hate and slander in her role, but this felt different. This felt personal. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to her car, leaning down with his hands resting on the door. "This isn't your neighborhood, Matthews. You don't belong here," he spat. And before she could respond, his hand reached for the door handle, yanking it open with force. Before Nia could even react, he was pulling her out of the car and slamming her against the side of it. Her breath hitched in her chest as the cold steel of his handcuffs snapped around her wrists. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, struggling against his iron grip. He ignored her, dragging her roughly by the arm toward his cruiser. "You think you're untouchable? You think you can come down here and make a mess of everything? You think you can just expose everyone and expect no one to care?" His voice was low, venomous, and Nia could feel his rage radiating off him. But she wouldn't let herself show fear. She refused to. Nia was internal affairs, the one who brought down dirty cops like Holloway. But it wasn't enough. His hands tightened around her wrists, the pain shooting up her arms as he shoved her against the cruiser. "Wrong neighborhood for you, Matthews," he sneered, his face twisted in contempt. "You don't get to come in here and pretend you're better than everyone else." Her breath was coming in sharp bursts now, the pressure of the handcuffs cutting into her skin. "This is illegal," Naya said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "You have no probable cause, Officer Holloway. I want to speak to my lawyer." But he wasn't listening. He was too busy with his own anger, his own sense of superiority. As he shoved her roughly into the side of the vehicle, Nia could hear the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered. People were beginning to take out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. She caught sight of a teenage girl with braids, her phone raised high as she shouted, "She didn't do anything! Let her go!" And for a moment, Nia felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. There were others watching, others who could see what was really happening here. But that brief hope was shattered when Holloway slammed her against the car again, his breath hot and foul in her ear as he muttered, "You think you're above me? Think you can just walk into our precinct and tell us how to do our jobs?" He shoved her harder against the car, causing her cheek to scrape against the hood. Pain flared across her face, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. If she showed any weakness, if she let him see how much this was affecting her, it would give him the power he needed to break her. "I'm not resisting," she called out to the crowd, her voice ringing loud and clear, cutting through the chaos around her. "I've identified myself. Check my credentials." For a moment, Holloway hesitated. His smirk faltered, and for a brief second, Nia thought she might have won. But then his smirk returned, wider and more malicious than before. "You don't fit the profile, Matthews. You're my girl," he said with a bark of laughter, twisting her arms behind her in a painful grip. "Robbery 2 blocks over? Fancy car? Yeah, you're my girl." It was a lie. They both knew it. Nia had just fled the scene of a fire at a nearby warehouse, and yet here she was, being accused of a crime she didn't commit. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady, but she could feel the anger bubbling up inside her. "This is illegal detainment! Release me now!" He ignored her, fumbling with his radio, his thick fingers clumsy as he lied into the device. "Dispatch, I've got a suspect resisting arrest." The lie rang out loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, and the outrage was immediate. Gasps of disbelief rippled through the onlookers as they began to shout, their voices rising in protest. But Holloway, it seemed, didn't care. He was used to people like her being silenced, people who dared to challenge the system. But Nia wasn't going to let him rewrite this story. She wouldn't back down. "I'm not resisting," she said again, her voice louder this time, echoing through the crowd. "I've identified myself. Check my credentials. I'm Nia Matthews, head of internal affairs." Holloway's grip faltered for a moment, and Nia saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. But it was brief. He shoved her harder against the car, the metal scraping against her cheek as he pinned her there. The pain was unbearable, but she fought it back, refusing to let him see that she was vulnerable. The situation had escalated so quickly, and Nia realized with a sinking feeling that Holloway had no intention of letting her go. His grip tightened, and when more officers showed up, she knew she was in deep trouble. The 3 officers who arrived, Harrington, Mills, and Klein, were all cut from the same cloth as Holloway, and they quickly surrounded her, smirking like they had already won. The tallest one, Harrington, took a step toward her, his badge gleaming under the dim streetlights. "Need a hand, Holloway?" he asked, his tone casual, as though they were discussing nothing more important than the weather. This wasn't just one cop. It was a whole precinct, a whole network of officers working together to bury the truth. "Internal affairs, huh? Fancy that," Harrington said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still looks like trouble to me." And it was clear to Nia in that moment that this wasn't just about her. This was about the system, about everything she had fought for. But in that crowd of officers, Nia knew there was only one thing that could save her: the truth. Her eyes flicked to the onlookers. Their phones were still recording, their faces filled with outrage as they watched this unfold. She could see the flicker of something in their eyes, a recognition that the truth was on her side. "You're making a mistake," she called out once more, her voice unwavering. "This is on video. You can't bury this." Trent Holloway was the one who was truly making the mistake. He thought he could intimidate her, crush her spirit, but he had underestimated the power of the truth. In that moment, Nia realized something. She wasn't alone. The crowd, their voices rising in her defense, was a reminder that there were people out there who believed in justice. There were people who would fight with her. And no matter what happened next, Nia knew that this battle was far from over. So, what happens next in Nia's fight for justice? What will Trent Holloway do when he realizes he has underestimated her? Will Nia's persistence win the day, or will the system bury her for good? Stay tuned and hit that like button if you stand with Nia. Don't forget to subscribe for more updates on this incredible journey of defiance, resistance, and truth. Nia Matthews never imagined that her fight against corruption would cost her so much. As the head of internal affairs in Atlanta, she had spent years meticulously uncovering the rot that festered within the very institution meant to serve and protect. She had built her career on exposing crooked cops and dismantling a system that had been complicit in countless injustices. But nothing could prepare her for the night when the very system she had sworn to protect turned against her. It started like any other evening. Nia had wrapped up a long day of sifting through case files, digging into evidence, and making connections between corrupt cops and shady politicians. She had just gotten into her silver SUV and was heading home, her mind preoccupied with the case she was working on, when the lights flickered in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it was nothing more than a routine traffic stop. But as the cruiser pulled up behind her, Nia's heart began to race. She could see it in the reflection of the side mirror. A familiar face. Officer Trent Holloway. Nia knew his reputation. He was notorious for bending the rules, using his badge to get away with things that would have landed anyone else in jail. And now, here he was, pulling her over in the middle of a quiet Atlanta street. Her mind flashed through the cases she'd investigated involving him, cases that were still open, still being worked. She hadn't expected him to come after her. Not like this, not so openly. She rolled down the window and greeted him professionally, flashing her badge. "Officer Holloway, can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. Holloway smirked, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. His gaze lingered on her badge, then flicked to her face. "Well, well, well, look who it is. The mighty head of internal affairs. I've been waiting for this day," he sneered. "You think you're above us? You think you can just tear apart everything we've built? I've got news for you, Matthews. This is my turf." Nia's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. She couldn't. Holloway had always been a thorn in her side, but this felt different. He wasn't just challenging her authority, he was sending a message. And Nia wasn't about to let him win. "I'm just doing my job, Holloway," she said, keeping her tone firm. "And so are you, I hope. If there's a problem, we can sort it out the proper way." But the moment those words left her mouth, she knew she was wasting her breath. Holloway's face darkened, and without warning he yanked the door open. Before she could react, he grabbed her by the arm and dragged her out of the car. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Nia demanded, struggling to free herself from his iron grip. He didn't answer, only shoved her harshly against the side of her SUV. The pain shot through her, but she kept her composure. This wasn't the first time she'd been targeted by someone like him, and she wasn't about to let him break her. "You're not going anywhere, Matthews. You've got no business in this neighborhood," Holloway spat. "You're out of your depth." Nia's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. She was being detained. Illegally. There was no probable cause. This was just Holloway's way of sending a message, making her feel powerless. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. She stood tall, her back straight despite the pressure on her shoulders, and looked him dead in the eye. "This is illegal, Holloway. Release me now," she demanded, her voice cold and professional. But Holloway wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in what was right or what the law said. He was interested in one thing: asserting his power over her. His hands dug into her arms, tightening until she winced in pain. "You're gonna regret this, Matthews," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just walk in here, act like you own the place, and get away with it? This is my city, my precinct." As he shoved her against the side of the car again, Nia's mind flashed back to everything she had worked for. The cases she'd cracked, the lives she'd saved, the corruption she had exposed. This man, this officer, wasn't just a cog in the system. He was the very embodiment of everything that was wrong with it, and now he was trying to crush her. She couldn't let him do that. "You're making a mistake," Nia said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I'm Nia Matthews, head of internal affairs. Check my credentials." For a brief moment, Holloway hesitated, the smirk faltering. But it didn't last long. He was too far gone, too full of rage and power to back down now. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, his grip tightening as he pulled her toward the back of his cruiser. "You're just another suspect to me." As he cuffed her hands behind her back, Nia felt a rush of fury flood her veins. He was lying. There was no reason for this. She hadn't done anything wrong. But Holloway was rewriting the narrative, turning the truth into something else entirely. "You've got nothing on me, Holloway," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're detaining me without cause. This is harassment." He laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed off the walls of the empty street. "Harassment? No, Matthews, this is just the beginning," he sneered. "You've made a lot of enemies, and I'm just one of them. You've been poking around in places you shouldn't be. Now you're gonna pay for it." As Nia was shoved into the back of his cruiser, her heart pounded in her chest. She had been in tough situations before. Long hours spent tracking down criminals, investigating corruption, staring down dangerous people with power. But this felt different. Holloway wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was part of a much larger, more dangerous system. And now that she was caught in its web, she had no idea how she was going to get out. She glanced through the rear window of the cruiser, catching a glimpse of the growing crowd that had gathered, their phones raised high as they filmed the scene. For a brief moment, Nia felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. There were people who saw what was happening, people who would stand up for her. But that hope was fleeting, crushed by the weight of Holloway's words. "You're done talking now," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "Let's get you out of here." As the cruiser sped through the city, Nia's mind raced. She had to think. She had to figure out a way to turn this around. She knew the law, knew the system inside and out. But this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for her very life. Holloway had made his move, but Nia wasn't ready to give up yet. She had faced so much in her career, the backlash, the slander, the threats. But nothing had ever been like this. She wasn't just fighting for her job now. She was fighting for her freedom. When they arrived at the precinct, Nia was pulled from the cruiser, her legs unsteady as she was dragged through the doors. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the dimly lit hallway as she was shoved into a holding cell. Alone, in the cold, with nothing but her thoughts, and the realization that she had just been caught in the most dangerous game of her life. The walls seemed to close in on her as the minutes stretched into hours. The only sound was the muffled noise of the precinct outside. It was a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But Nia wasn't going to break. She couldn't. Not when so many depended on her. Not when she had come so far. She had fought for justice her entire career, had bled for it, and she wasn't about to let Holloway or anyone else stop her now. She was stronger than this. She had to be. The fight was far from over. And Nia knew one thing for sure. If there was one thing she had left to give, it was her voice, her unwavering will to fight for what was right. If you're feeling the weight of this struggle, if Nia's relentless pursuit of justice has inspired you, hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to the channel to follow her journey, because this fight is just beginning, and it's one you won't want to miss. Stay with us as we uncover what happens next in this story of defiance, courage, and the fight against corruption. Together, we'll make sure Nia's voice is heard. Nia Matthews had always been a woman who believed in the power of justice, the unwavering force that could right the wrongs of society. As the head of internal affairs in Atlanta, her career had been defined by uncovering corruption, exposing the rotten core of a system she had sworn to protect. She had always been the one to stand tall in the face of injustice, never afraid to speak out, to put her life on the line for what was right. But nothing could have prepared her for the night when the very system she had devoted herself to would turn on her with the full force of its power. It all started on a quiet evening as she drove home, her mind preoccupied with the case she was working on, when the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror. It was a moment that would forever change her life. Nia didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't uncommon for officers to pull her over, especially given her role at Internal Affairs. But when she saw who was behind the wheel of the cruiser, her heart sank. Officer Trent Holloway. Nia knew him well. He was a cop who played fast and loose with the law, one of the many who had benefited from the system of corruption she had spent years trying to dismantle. He was one of the bad ones, the kind of cop who twisted the law to his advantage, using his badge as a shield to cover up his own dark deeds. She had investigated him before, and the more she dug, the more she uncovered about his ties to shady dealings and unsavory characters. But tonight was different. Tonight, Nia Matthews would become his target. As she pulled over and rolled down her window, she could feel her heart racing, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. She met Holloway's gaze, his eyes cold and calculating, the same smirk he wore whenever he thought he had the upper hand. "Well, well, well," Holloway sneered. "Look who it is. The big shot from Internal Affairs. You've been making a lot of noise lately, Matthews, and you think you can just walk around here digging into things you shouldn't? This is my turf." Nia's blood boiled. She had spent years working to clean up the system, and now this man, this corrupt officer, was challenging her in the most personal way possible. "I'm just doing my job," Nia replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "And you should be doing yours too, Holloway." But instead of backing down, Holloway took a step closer, his gaze turning from hostile to outright threatening. "You've been poking around in places you shouldn't be," Holloway growled, his words dripping with venom. "And now you're going to pay the price. You think you can come into my world and dismantle everything I've built? You think you're untouchable?" Nia stood her ground, despite the rising tension. This wasn't just another routine traffic stop. This was personal. Holloway wasn't just a cop. He was part of the larger system she had been fighting against for years, and now he was making sure she knew just how deep that system ran. "You're making a mistake," Nia said, trying to remain calm. "I've done nothing wrong. Let me go." But Holloway wasn't listening. He didn't care about the truth. He had already made up his mind. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip ironclad, and yanked her out of the car. "Let go of me!" Nia shouted, trying to pull free. But Holloway wasn't having any of it. "Shut your mouth, Matthews!" he snapped, shoving her roughly against the side of her SUV. Pain shot through her side, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. He was trying to break her, to humiliate her, and she wasn't going to let him win. "You don't belong here," Holloway sneered, his face inches from hers, his breath foul with the stench of tobacco. "You're not welcome in this neighborhood. You think you're better than me, don't you?" His words were sharp, laced with hatred and bitterness, and for a moment, Naya felt a surge of anger that threatened to overtake her. But she kept her composure, knowing that showing weakness would only give him more power over her. "This is illegal, Holloway," Naya said, her voice unwavering. "You're detaining me without cause. You have no right to do this." But Holloway wasn't interested in the law. He didn't care about rules or procedures. He had already decided what his next move was. With a cruel laugh, he snapped handcuffs onto her wrists, tightening them until they bit into her skin. The cold metal felt like a heavy weight around her wrists, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system she had spent her life trying to expose. "You're going to regret this," Holloway muttered as he shoved her roughly into the back of his cruiser. Naya's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't break. She couldn't. This was her moment to fight back, to show him that no matter how many times he tried to break her, she would never back down. As the car sped down the dark streets, Naya's mind raced. She was being falsely arrested. She knew the law better than anyone, and she knew she was in the right. But the truth didn't matter to Holloway. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. And Holloway was determined to take hers. By the time they arrived at the precinct, Nia's mind was spinning. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, her pulse racing with a combination of fear and fury. She had been brought into the very place she had spent years fighting against. The precinct was a symbol of everything she had dedicated her life to exposing, and now she was being dragged through its doors as if she were the criminal. She was thrown into a holding cell, alone with her thoughts, with nothing but the cold, hard reality of what was happening. Holloway had made his move. He had played his hand. And she was caught in his trap. But even in the darkest moments, Nia refused to give up. She couldn't let this be the end of her fight. The world was watching. The crowd outside, the phones recording every moment. There were people who saw what was happening. There were people who knew the truth. And Nia was determined to make sure that truth was heard. "I'm not done," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "I will not let him win." But as the hours passed, as the reality of her situation set in, Nia knew that it wasn't going to be easy. Holloway wasn't just any cop. He was part of a network, a system that went deeper than she could have ever imagined. And now, he was using that power to try to crush her. But she wasn't going to let him. Through the haze of fear and frustration, Nia's resolve hardened. She wasn't the type to back down, not even when the odds were stacked against her. She had spent her career fighting for justice, exposing corruption, and she wasn't going to let one man destroy everything she had worked for. "This is far from over," she muttered to herself, clenching her fists. "I'm going to fight back. I'm going to make sure they all know the truth." And so, Nia began to plan. Her mind was racing, her thoughts sharp despite the exhaustion. She had to find a way to expose Holloway for what he really was. A crooked cop, part of a much larger network of corruption that reached into every corner of the system. She knew that the truth would set her free. It always did. But she had to fight for it. She couldn't let Holloway win. Her pulse quickened as she formulated a plan. The crowd outside, the phones recording every second. She could use that. The world was watching. The truth was out there, and she was going to make sure everyone saw it. She wasn't going to let her fight be in vain. As she sat in the holding cell, Her wrists aching from the cuffs and her mind spinning with possibilities, Nia thought about what she had to lose. Her job, her reputation, her freedom. But she also thought about what she had to gain. Justice. And she wasn't going to stop until she had it. If you're feeling the weight of Nia's struggle, if you're inspired by her courage and resolve, drop a comment below to show your support. Let her know you're behind her in this fight. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep up with the journey, because this story isn't over yet. We've only just begun to uncover the depths of corruption and the lengths Nia will go to fight for what's right. Stay tuned for the next chapter, because you won't want to miss it. Nia Matthews had spent years of her life dedicated to the cause of justice, working tirelessly in internal affairs to expose the deep rot within the police system of Atlanta. She was a fighter. Her life's work centered on rooting out corruption, giving a voice to those silenced by the very institutions meant to protect them. She had clawed her way to the top, from humble beginnings in a city that had never offered her a leg up. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight, she was in a fight she never could have anticipated. A battle that threatened not only her career, but everything she had fought for. It began like any other evening. As she drove home from the office, her thoughts preoccupied with a new investigation she had been working on. But as she glanced into the rearview mirror, her heart skipped a beat. The flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser were closing in behind her. Her first instinct was to pull over, but as she slowed down, she caught a glimpse of who was driving. It was him, Officer Trent Holloway, the very man she had been trying to take down for months. Holloway was a man who had always skirted the lines of legality, a cop whose hands were stained with corruption, and who used his badge to shield his sins. He was everything Nia had worked against in the department, a symbol of everything wrong with the system she had spent her life trying to fix. As she stopped her car and rolled down her window, she couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety. There was something about Holloway's presence that sent a shiver down her spine. His cold stare and self-assured grin told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't here for a routine traffic stop. He wasn't here to protect the law. He was here to remind her who had the power. "Long night, Matthews?" Holloway sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "Been stirring the pot again, huh?" Nia's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Just doing my job, Holloway," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. "And it looks like you're doing yours too." She tried to keep it professional, but she could see the malicious gleam in his eyes. He didn't care about the law. He wasn't here to do his job. He was here to show her that she didn't have any power in this system. He was here to break her. "Job?" Holloway laughed, stepping closer, his bulky frame casting a shadow over her. "You think you have a job, Matthews? You think you're above me just because you wear that fancy title? You think your badge means something out here?" He was taunting her now, his voice dripping with contempt. Nia could feel the heat rising in her chest. She had fought for this position, fought tooth and nail to prove herself in a system that had always favored people like him, people who thought they were above the law. But she couldn't let him bait her. She couldn't let him see her fear. "I'm not above anyone, Holloway," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I'm here to do my job, just like you should be. But clearly you've forgotten what that means." Holloway's smirk faltered, and for a moment Nia thought she might have gotten through to him. But then, without warning, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip vice-like. "What's wrong, Matthews? You don't want to play anymore?" he taunted, pulling her out of the car with a rough jerk. "You've been poking around in places you shouldn't be. You've been making life harder for people like me. And now you're going to learn what happens when you try to stand up to the system." Fear gripped Nia's heart, but she didn't let it show. She fought against him, twisting in his grasp, but his grip only tightened. "Let go of me!" she shouted. But Holloway only laughed, shoving her against the side of her car with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. The pain was sharp, but the rage inside her was even sharper. "Get your hands off me," she spat, struggling to free herself. But he didn't listen. His face was inches from hers now, and she could see the malice in his eyes, the satisfaction he took in her struggle. "You think you're untouchable, huh? You think you're better than me because you wear that badge? You think you can take me down without consequences?" His voice dropped to a low growl. "I'm going to show you exactly what happens when you cross someone like me." The world around her felt like it was spinning, but she fought to keep her footing. "This is illegal," she said, trying to stay calm, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "You can't do this, Holloway. You're detaining me, without cause. I know my rights." But Holloway just laughed again, a low, mocking sound that made Nia's skin crawl. "Your rights?" he sneered. "You don't have any rights anymore, Matthews. Not when you're on my turf. Not when you've been digging into things you shouldn't be. This isn't your world anymore. You're nothing but a target." Nia's heart pounded in her chest as he snapped handcuffs onto her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. The pain was sharp, but the humiliation was worse. She had spent years in internal affairs, exposing the dark underbelly of the department, and now she was being dragged through its halls as if she were the criminal. "Release me," she demanded, her voice steady, even though her chest felt tight with panic. But Holloway wasn't listening. He shoved her into the back of his cruiser with a force that left her breathless. The door slammed shut behind her, and the car started moving. Nia's thoughts were a whirlwind, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what was happening. She had been arrested. Falsely, no less. And the man who had done it was the very embodiment of everything she had spent years trying to dismantle. She was being taken to the precinct, to a place where officers like Holloway ruled with impunity, where the rules didn't apply to people like him. It was a place where corruption ran so deep, it felt like it was part of the very fabric of the system. Nia had exposed that corruption. But tonight, it was turning on her. The thoughts swirling in her head were dizzying, but one thing was clear. She was going to have to fight harder than ever before if she was going to survive this. By the time they arrived at the precinct, Nia's stomach was twisted in knots. She could feel the eyes of the officers in the hallway as they passed, their glares filled with suspicion and contempt. She was a traitor in their eyes, a threat to the status quo, and they were ready to make her pay for it. But Nia didn't break. She couldn't. She had been through too much, had fought too long to let this be the end. As she was shoved into a holding cell, she knew she had to keep her wits about her. She couldn't let them see her fear. She couldn't let them know how badly she wanted to break free, to run, to escape this nightmare that she had found herself in. But she was trapped, and Holloway knew it. She sat in the cold concrete cell, her wrists aching from the cuffs, the weight of everything crashing down on her. Her badge was gone, her career shattered, and the man who had put her here was still out there, laughing in the face of the system she had dedicated her life to. The weight of it was unbearable, but through the crushing darkness, Nia held on to one thing: hope. She couldn't let Holloway win. She couldn't let him destroy everything she had fought for. She would find a way to expose him, to take him down once and for all. She had to. Hours passed in that cell, the coldness of it seeping into her bones. But Nia didn't give up. She sat there, gathering her strength, plotting her next move. She knew the truth would come out eventually, and she was determined to make sure it was her voice that told it, no matter the cost. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the cell door creaking open. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat, and saw a familiar face. Her partner. Marcus Tate. He had always been by her side, through the hardest times, the darkest moments. And now, he was here, fighting for her when she needed it the most. "I'm getting you out of here," Marcus said, his voice steady, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We're not done yet, Nia." And in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, she knew that her fight wasn't over. She wasn't alone. But even as Marcus worked to get her out of the precinct, Nia knew that Holloway's reach went deeper than they had thought. This fight was bigger than she could have ever imagined, and it was only just beginning. She had exposed him once, but now she had to do it again. She had to show the world the truth, no matter the cost. If you're moved by Nia's strength, her resolve, her relentless fight for justice, drop a comment below to show your support. Let her know you're standing with her in this battle. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because the fight for truth is far from over. Stay tuned for the next chapter. The war against corruption is just getting started. Nia Matthews had always known that the fight for justice wasn't going to be easy. As the head of internal affairs in Atlanta, she had spent years working tirelessly to expose the corruption in the police force, taking on systemic injustices that were often ignored. She had witnessed firsthand how deeply rooted corruption could be, how easily the system could be manipulated to protect the wrong people. She'd faced countless obstacles along the way, racial profiling, slander, and even death threats. But nothing had prepared her for the brutality she was about to face. It all started when Nia's investigation into a prominent officer, Trent Holloway, took a darker turn. Holloway was a cop who was known for his ruthlessness, and his ties to a white supremacist network only added to his power. Nia had begun to uncover the depth of his corruption, and with every new revelation, the danger surrounding her grew. She had seen corruption like this before, but it was never quite as personal as this. Trent Holloway was the embodiment of everything Nia had fought against: racism, violence, and a complete disregard for the law. And now, he had set his sights on her. One evening, Nia was driving home after a long day of work when she saw the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She knew instantly who it was: Holloway. His cruiser pulled up behind her, and he wasted no time in getting out of the car. As he approached her vehicle, his cold, malicious smile sent a chill down her spine. "Long day, Matthews?" he asked, his tone mocking. "I bet you think you're above me now that you've got a fancy title? But you're not. You're just a threat to everything I stand for." Nia didn't flinch. She had faced this kind of disdain before. But Holloway wasn't done. He pulled her from the car, his hands rough as he threw her against the side of her vehicle. Her pulse quickened, but she held her composure. This wasn't the first time a crooked officer had tried to intimidate her, but what Holloway didn't realize was that Nia had spent years preparing for moments like this. She had the law on her side, the knowledge, and the drive to bring down people like him. And no matter how hard he tried to break her, she wasn't going to let him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear creeping up in her chest. "You're making a mistake," Holloway laughed. "Oh, I think you're the one who's made the mistake, Matthews. You should have known when to quit, but you kept poking the bear." The word stung, but Nia didn't let him see it. He was trying to rattle her, to get her to show weakness. But she was smarter than that. She had been through worse. She knew what she was up against. As Holloway tried to manhandle her into the back of his cruiser, Nia's thoughts raced. She knew she was in danger, but she also knew that her fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been oppressed, everyone who had been silenced by the system. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let him win, not when she had come this far. They took her to the precinct, where she was thrown into a holding cell. As she sat there, handcuffed and alone, Nia allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had spent so many years working to expose corruption, to give a voice to the voiceless, to fight for what was right. And now, everything she had worked for seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Holloway had managed to turn the tables on her, painting her as a criminal, a threat to the system she had spent years trying to fix. But Nia wasn't a quitter. She had learned from the struggles of her life that the fight for justice was never going to be easy. There would always be obstacles, always be people who would try to stop her. But that didn't mean she would give up. And she didn't. With the help of her allies, Marcus Tate, her loyal deputy, and Lena Voss, a private investigator who had helped her dig into Holloway's corrupt ties, Nia launched a counterattack. She leaked the incriminating evidence, exposing the financial ties between Holloway and the white supremacist network he was a part of. She used her own story, her own struggle, as a weapon against him. And it worked. The evidence was undeniable. Holloway's empire was crumbling. His suspension was just the beginning. The more Nia pushed, the more cracks appeared in the system. The protests outside the precinct swelled, the people rallying behind her. They saw the truth. They saw the lies. They saw the corruption that had been allowed to thrive for so long. But the fight didn't end there. Holloway was desperate. He tried to strike back in the most vicious way possible, by targeting Nia's family. He kidnapped her son, Malik, and used him as leverage to try to break her. The thought of losing Malik was enough to send Nia's heart racing, but she couldn't let fear control her. She couldn't let him win. Through sheer determination and quick thinking, Nia rescued Malik from the clutches of Holloway's goons. But Holloway wasn't done yet. He orchestrated a series of brutal attacks on Nia, using his connections in the police force to silence her. A false video was made, framing her as a corrupt officer, and the entire system turned on her. She was arrested on false charges, her career and reputation dragged through the mud. The fight seemed lost. But even in the darkest of times, Nia didn't give up. She knew the truth. She knew that her fight wasn't just for her, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed by a system that didn't care about justice. And with the support of her community, she found the strength to keep going. She took down Holloway's entire network, exposing the deep corruption that had been allowed to thrive within the police force. Through her determination and courage, Nia showed that justice isn't something that can be taken away. It's something that must be fought for, every single day. She didn't let the system crush her. She didn't let them break her spirit. And in the end, she came out victorious. Nia's story is a powerful reminder that we must always stand up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against us. It teaches us that no matter how many times we fall, no matter how many obstacles we face, we can always rise again. Injustice may feel like it's winning, but as long as we continue to fight, as long as we stand up for those who can't, we can bring about real change. Her story also reminds us of the power of community. Nia's victory wasn't hers alone. She had the support of her friends, her allies, and the people who believed in her cause. Together, they exposed the truth. Together, they fought for justice. And together, they showed that even the most powerful systems can be brought down when people come together for a common cause. So, what can we learn from Nia's journey? First, don't give up when things get hard. Don't let the system or the people in power break you. Second, fight for the truth, even when it feels like no one is listening. Third, know that you are never alone in your struggles. You have the power of community, of people who care, who will stand by you and fight alongside you. If Nia's story has inspired you, if you've felt the weight of her struggle and the power of her resilience, drop a comment below to show your support for her. Let her know you're with her in this fight for justice. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like Nia's. We need more voices like hers. Voices that won't back down in the face of adversity. Voices that will stand up for what's right no matter the cost. This isn't the end of Nia's story. It's just the beginning. And if we continue to fight, we can make the world a better place for everyone. Stay tuned for more, and thank you for being part of this journey.